His presidency has been defined by the war on terror, a war he is determined to win.
I can hear you!
I think he found his voice and his mission on that pile of rubble down at Ground Zero the week after the attacks.
And the people who knock these buildings down will hear all of us soon.
His personality has been dissected by supporters and critics alike.
Whatever it is, whatever he's doing, people love being around him, love working with him, and are magnetized to him.
Something is either on his radar screen or it's not. And if it's not, it's really not.
Every nation in every region now has a decision to make. Either you are with us or you are with the terrorists.
And posterity will determine if his decisions were wrong or right.
It's hard to argue that he has done anything other than stake his entire presidency on the idea that he's right about Iraq.
He is a man comfortable with clarity, that is, there is good and there is evil in the world, and suddenly the world broke exactly into that worldview for him.
America will stand with the allies of freedom to support democratic movements in the Middle East and beyond, with the ultimate goal of ending tyranny in our world.
George Walker Bush was born on July 6, 1946, in New Haven, Connecticut. His father, George Herbert Bush, like other veterans of World War II, was attending Yale University on the GI Bill. Young George would be followed by a sister, Robin, in 1949, and a brother, John Ellis Bush, nicknamed Jeb, 3 years later. The children had been born into a well-to-do, old-established, and very social family, prominent in banking. George's grandfather, Prescott Bush, became a senator from Connecticut in the early 1950s. This accomplished dynasty would prove both a blessing and a burden to the Bush children. Barbara Pierce, George's mother, met his father, George Bush, at a Christmas party in Greenwich, Connecticut. They would be married when he returned from World War II in 1945. In 1948, Bush left behind his Eastern establishment roots and drove his red Studebaker southwest to the booming oil fields of West Texas. It was a complete break with the family tradition. By 1950, they had settled in the small oil boom town of Midland, Texas.
It's a place that you come upon out in the desert, you really do. It's almost its own little Oz. You drive up on it and the city wells up out of the desert. There are skyscrapers in the middle of the desert. And there was a boom town, and the price of oil was skyrocketing, and they were digging deeper and finding more oil and richer deposits.
George Bush formed his own oil company in Midland. He was frequently away on business, and so Barbara and young George had to keep each other company. That may be how George W. inherited his mother's sense of humor and sharp wit. The Bushes lived in a modest neighborhood where life was safe and secure.
We moved into a funny little house on Easter Egg Row, and we had a lot of friends there. We had a blue house, and great friends, the Richies, had sort of a purple house, and someone else had a yellow house, and we paid $8,000 for that house. And we thought it was the cat's meow.
They were happy together and enjoyed spending time with their children. But in 1953, tragedy struck. Their daughter, 3-year-old Robin, fell ill. The shocking diagnosis was leukemia. The family was devastated.
And this gorgeous little girl was going to die, and it was just horrible. And so everybody that knew them, we tried real hard to do everything we could to help.
Barbara Bush and Robin made frequent trips to New York City's Sloan Kettering Hospital for treatments. Young George became even closer to his father during that time. In 1953, very little was known about leukemia, and 7 months after being diagnosed, Robin passed away.
We had to tell him that Robin had died. And he was He was wonderful about it. I mean, we all wept and cried, but he really spent the time making it easier for us.
After Robin's death, young George felt more compelled than ever to be his mother's best friend. He'd often forego playing with his own friends to keep his mother company.
I sort of ended up by relying enormously on George W. And a lot of friends, I think, thought maybe I was sort of spending too much time with him. I had Jebby at that time too, brand new baby. But George was so sweet to me and so funny and cute and nice, and it suddenly came to me that my friends were right, because I heard a boy out the window say one day, well, I said, come on out and play, George. And he said, well, I can't, I've got to play with my mother. So that's when I sort of let loose of him.
The family's sadness would be softened with the birth of 3 more children: Neil in 1955, Marvin in 1956, and a daughter, Dorothy, nicknamed Doro, in 1959. Young George's life was a happy one in Midland. He had plenty of pals, and several have remained lifelong friends. He was a lightning rod for kids in the neighborhood, gathering them together for games of football and baseball. His hero was the great Willie Mays.
Well, we were mainly into athletics. We used a ball, a round ball or an oblong ball, and did everything with that. Good place to grow up.
In 1959, the Bushes moved to Houston, and the following year, 14-year-old George W., like his father, was sent off to Phillips Academy in Andover, Massachusetts, an exclusive boarding school for boys. Here he'd have to go one-on-one with his father's reputation, constantly reminded of how bright and how popular his dad had been.
And his father's shadow was very wide and profound at Andover, and it was hard for him at Andover to ignore his father's presence.
After small-town Texas life, prep school was a big change.
It was a very regimented place. There was a great deal of structure. You had to be at breakfast by 7:45 in the morning, and at 8:05 you had to leave to go to chapel, and chapel began at 8:12, and class began at 8:19, and you had 7 minutes to get anywhere in the class. So it was a very, very structured day.
In this all-male prep school, there was little opportunity for dating.
Social scene at Andover? There wasn't any. Zero. I was somewhat envious of my high school buddies back in Texas, knowing that on the Friday night high school football games, they'd be going out with their girlfriends, and there I was trying to figure out what to do. But there was not much of a social scene.
Since other outlets for a social life were in short supply, sports was the focus. He played basketball and baseball and became Andover's head cheerleader. He had no trouble on the ball field, but the classroom was another matter.
One of the early papers I had to write was about emotions. And I had in the paper, it was talking about tears running down the cheeks, either me or whoever the subject was of the story, and I thought that maybe I had overused the word tear. So I pulled out the Roget Thesaurus that Mother had sent me and looked for the longest word I could find and put lacerates were falling down the fellow's cheeks. Much to the amazement of the professor. And I think it probably was the first English paper I got, and it was a big fat 0.
George followed his father's footsteps again in 1964 when he entered Yale University. Also like his father, he joined the secret Skull and Bones Society and Delta Kappa Epsilon fraternity, where he became the president. The fraternity had a reputation. In Bush's senior year, it was fined for its hazing practices, including branding the fraternity's name on the backs of pledges.
Our fraternity was kind of known for having raucous parties and wild bands and lots of beer flowing, and so I think all 50 people in our pledge class could lay claim to the fact that when they were young and irresponsible, they were young and irresponsible.
Besides partying, George Bush was also engaged to be married, briefly, in his junior year. By his senior year, 1968, life had changed for all undergraduates as the war in Vietnam became their central concern. Bush graduated from Yale with a degree in history. He chose to enlist in the Texas National Guard and flew F-102 jet fighters on weekends for 5 years. By signing up for the National Guard, he was automatically removed as a candidate for the draft. Guard units could be called up for service in Vietnam, but his unit never was. In the cockpit, he once again lived in the shadow of his father, who had been a decorated pilot in World War II. George W. got to test his own mettle in the pilot seat of an F-102.
You release the brakes and then you flip it to afterburner and you get this big explosion. And I can remember sitting at the end of the runway, and it didn't matter where you were, who you are, where you were going. What mattered was the moment. And it did cause you to focus.
Bush flew for 5 years on weekends with the National Guard. But there was also plenty of time for pretty girls and partying in Houston.
I think it was the Washington Post that once said, if George Elder was the boring first husband that every woman once had, George Jr. was the wild boyfriend that every woman had in their youth. He was a character, and women liked being around him.
George Bush refers to this period as his nomadic years, searching for the direction his life should take. That search would eventually take him back to his childhood home in Midland, Texas, with the dream of striking it rich. He was going to reenact the journey his father had taken 3 decades before. In the early 70s, George W. Bush was serving in the National Guard. The question was, what to do for the rest of his life. He decided in 1973 to head back east and get a master's degree in business administration at Harvard University. 2 years later, degree in hand, he repeated the trip his father had made in 1948, setting out for the oil fields of West Texas, booming again thanks to the Arab oil embargo. The Bush children had been raised to be independent and self-reliant. When George W. returned to Midland, he was determined to make it on his own. He lived simply, to the point that close friends often ribbed him about his thriftiness, a trait he was known for throughout his life.
Extremely frugal, extremely frugal. If you were investing in an oil deal with him, it was good, because he was a good steward of your funds if you were invested with him, but a little slow to pick up the tab at dinner time.
He lived in a one-bedroom apartment that his friends described as a toxic waste dump.
And he'd scour your dirty clothes bag for your cleanest dirty shirt, something like he could use. And that's not exaggeration. I threw out a shirt one time, he found it and said, that looks pretty good. 3 or 4 years later, he's still wearing it. I mean, that's just the way he is.
After he spent 2 years learning the oil business, he set up his own company called Arbusto, Spanish for bush. He would never achieve his father's level of success in the oil business, but he was able to make a comfortable living.
I'm George Bush, running for the Congress.
In 1977, Bush followed his father once again, this time into politics. He decided to run for the congressional seat in West Texas. To some friends, it seemed rash, a spur-of-the-moment decision.
I'll listen to you, I'll work hard for you, and I'll introduce and vote for legislation that's in our best interest. Together, we can do a lot for West Texas.
I don't know that he planned it out or thought it out a whole lot. It was, I'm sure he did to a degree, but it seemed to me almost impulsive.
I'll say one thing about campaigning for office in West Texas. You sure do get to do plenty of driving.
At least Bush wouldn't be alone on the campaign trail. That summer of 1977, his friends the O'Neills invited him over for a barbecue. Their only other invited guest was a pretty librarian, Laura Welsh. She'd grown up in Midland, but they had never met. Sparks ignited when these two very opposite personalities came together.
There was 4 of us, and O'Neill said, I want you to meet a great friend of ours. I think you'll like her. And he was right. I not only liked her, I loved her. And I think we met in July and were married in November. It was what we call a whirlwind courtship.
I mean, to understand this marriage, you have to understand that Laura was a librarian when he met her, and Bush was exactly the kind of guy librarians would tell to shut up in the library.
After only 4 months of dating, George and Laura got married. It was a small, intimate wedding shared with close friends and family. And they spent their honeymoon on the campaign trail.
We spent a great first year of marriage traveling up the panhandle of Texas with the New Mexico border on one side. I think a lot of times people say that their first year of marriage is difficult because they're trying to get adjusted to living with each other. And I'll have to say that we did not have a difficult first year because in politics you always have an opponent, and it wasn't each other, so we got along great.
Laura's new mother-in-law, Barbara Bush, had only one bit of advice for her as she set off on her first campaign. And Laura learned the hard way the price of ignoring it and the heat of her husband's temper.
And I would give it to any politician's wife. Don't ever criticize your husband.
They were coming back from having given a speech in Lubbock one night. George turned to Laura and said, "Well, you haven't said anything. What did you think of the speech?" And she replied, not forgetting what her mother-in-law told her, she replied, "Well, I really didn't like it." And with that, the governor drove through the back of the garage.
Bush lost his first election, but he got over his disappointment quickly, chalking it up to a learning experience. He also had his new life with Laura to look forward to. 3 years later, in 1981, he and Laura celebrated the birth of twin daughters, Barbara and Jenna, named after their grandmothers. Both had been eager to have children, and they were thrilled when they had twins.
Sort of the sweetest time of our life, I remember, is when the babies drank bottles and we'd get in bed in the morning drinking coffee, reading the newspapers. Each one of us would be feeding one of them our bottle, and that was a very happy time for us. It was perfect to have two babies, one for each of us to hold all the time, and George did that.
The oil business was in a slump in the mid-'80s, and Bush's new company, Spectrum 7, was struggling. In 1986, he merged it with the larger Harken Energy Corporation, located in Dallas. He was retained as a well-paid consultant to Harken and moved his family to an upper-class neighborhood. As always, he loved to socialize and drink with friends, but as he reached his 40th birthday, his drinking was putting a strain on his marriage. Years of partying were beginning to take their toll. Waking up with a raging hangover after his 40th birthday party, he decided to stop, and he hasn't had a drink since.
At one point in time, I just quit drinking. And it was the smartest thing I've done, or one of the smartest things I've done in life. Because, and I was not a clinical alcoholic by any stretch of the imagination, but alcohol was competing with my energies. And occasionally would have too much, and that's when the quips got me in trouble generally, particularly with my wife. And but I quit, and I'm glad I did.
Around the time he gave up drinking, Bush sought spiritual counseling from his parents' close friend, the Reverend Billy Graham. He renewed his commitment to the Christian faith and started attending the Methodist Church regularly. Bush's main push to give up alcohol came from his sense of family. He clearly adored the twins and spent as much time as he could with them. His family would join the larger Bush clan at the family estate in Kennebunkport, Maine, during the summers. His relationship with his children mirrored the close relationship he'd always had with his own parents. With their busy schedules, George W., the eldest son, valued the moments he could spend with his father. Because they were so close, the senior Bush asked his son to come to Washington to be an advisor on his campaign team in 1988. George Herbert Bush had been vice president for 2 terms in the Reagan administration. Now he was running for the top position, and he wanted his eldest son on the team, someone he knew he could trust implicitly and would always tell him the truth.
What was happening here was that Bush, the Midland oil guy, the beer drinker, the Houston partier, the Yale frat boy, was growing up. And he was realizing that he had a responsibility to keep the Bush name strong. And he went to war for his father.
On January 20th, 1989, George Herbert Bush became the 41st President of the United States. It was a sweet victory for the whole family after months of hard work. But young George's proximity to power was not going to change his down-home Texan ways, even when he attended a dinner with the Queen of England.
And I put George at the end of the table and told Her Majesty I put him there so he wouldn't get into terrible trouble. And Her Majesty was very cute about it, and she looked down at him and said, "Well, George, why do they think that you're the black sheep in the family?" And he said, "Well, I don't know, Your Majesty," but he said, "Every family has black sheep. You have them in your family, don't you?" The whole table went to a deep silence. But he is outrageous, and she loved him.
Although he enjoyed the occasional state dinner in Washington, he was eager to return home to Dallas and get on with his own life. But when he arrived back in Texas, his life took an interesting turn. A business associate offered him the chance to invest in the Texas Rangers baseball team and become the team's managing general partner. For a kid who had idolized Willie Mays, it was the dream job. George W. Bush had done his part to put his father in the White House in 1988. Now it was time for him to get on with his own life. And this was the moment friends invited him to invest in the Texas Rangers and become a managing general partner. They knew the Bush name would attract other major investors. The job was perfect for Bush, too. The high visibility would prove an asset for his political future, and he loved baseball.
I grew up as a baseball fan. I never dreamt I'd be a part of an ownership group of a major league club. But it's something that I guess must have been always in my mind, because when I saw the opportunity, I seized it. I said to myself, this is as good as it gets.
Hall of Famer Nolan Ryan became a close friend, and Bush was there to cheer him on the day he pitched his 7th no-hitter. Still an all-time record.
He is a great fan of the game of baseball and is a student of the game. And then also, he likes people, and it gave him an opportunity to get out and visit with the fans and promote something that he felt really strong about.
Man, what happened to your Ranger hat? Oh, that's your ball game cap, all right.
Bush loved his job, and he also had a goal: to build a new stadium he could point to with pride, an achievement uniquely his own in a domain outside his father's. When the house that Bush built opened finally in 1994, the timing could not have been more perfect. He was already campaigning to be the next governor of Texas. In 1992, when the construction of the stadium was just beginning, George Bush took a break from his own career to once again help his father on his re-election campaign. This time, the media and his opponents were much more critical of the president, blaming him for the recession and the budget deficit. George W. was always ready to step up and defend his father.
I can't wait for the debates. They're going to say, oh, he can't debate this Slick Willie or Ross. He's not going to be able to stand up on the stage with him. He'll knock a home run.
And that was a very ugly campaign, ugly inside the party and ugly versus the other party, and very disturbing to him as a son, I think, not as a public servant or somebody in the public arena, but very ugly as a son.
I plead guilty to loving my dad and to being fiercely loyal. And I told people, unfortunately told some members of the press, that I thought they were mistreating my dad, and I told people on our campaign team that I didn't appreciate him cutting and running from a guy that's a good man. That when times got tough, I expected them to stay in the foxhole with us, and if they tried to jump out, I grabbed them by the throat and put them back in.
President Bush's defeat in 1992 to Bill Clinton was a painful one for the family. The Bush family might have turned their backs on politics, but George and his brother Jeb surprised a lot of people when they decided to run for governor. Jeb in Florida and George in Texas. It was not going to be easy for George. His opponent would be the very popular and highly colorful Democrat, Ann Richards. Since George W. was known to lose his temper when his father was attacked, The Democrats counted on his erupting when he was the target of Ann Richards' attacks.
And he may be only a 2% owner of his ball club, but he has been running down Texas 100% of the time.
Instead, Bush impressed the pundits and press with his easygoing style.
The Richards people were certain that he would make a gaffe. They were sure that he would do something stupid during the campaign. And that's what was so interesting, was that the governor, Ann Richards, was sort of phlegmatic about the campaign. She really wasn't all that engaged, whereas George W. Bush was totally engaged, totally disciplined, never made a mistake, ran a near-perfect campaign.
In the '94 campaign, when I ran for governor, people said, "Oh, don't worry, he's got such a temper that he'll lose the campaign because of his temper." What they forgot was that there's a huge difference between being the loyal son and for being the candidate.
During the campaign, there were questions raised about certain business transactions that had taken place in 1990, when Bush was a paid consultant with the Harkin Energy Corporation.
The big question is whether George Bush Jr. used insider trading knowledge to sell the stock that he owned in Harkin Energy. The timing of it was suspect. He was working on a committee examining the financial condition of the company and the very possible restructuring it because the financial condition was so dire. He sold the stock in June of 1990. A few weeks later, in July, Harkin's quarterly numbers came out. They were awful. And the stock lost 60% of its value over the next 6 months. In addition, George Bush didn't apparently report the sale of the stock as he's required to do by federal law to the Securities and Exchange Commission. He says he filed a notice and the SEC lost it. The SEC says they didn't get the notice.
The SEC took no action regarding the sale of the stock, but other questions arose in the press about a potentially lucrative contract awarded to Harkin for offshore drilling in Bahrain. Insiders were astounded when a relatively small player like Harkin won out over larger companies like Amoco.
There were a number of stories written and inquiries and investigations uncorked to see if there was some linkage between the President of the United States, his son, and Harkin Energy being awarded this very lucrative contract in Bahrain.
No charges were ever brought, and the media coverage had little impact on the campaign in Texas. On Election Day, Bush won with 53% of the vote, against 47% for Richards. The win shocked many, including George W.'s parents, who thought that Jeb had the better chance of winning in Florida. Jeb lost in Florida, but would win the governorship 4 years later. Inauguration Day, January 17, 1995. The third generation of the Bush family was ushered into public office. Life was different now. Like his parents, Bush and his family would have to live under the media's microscope. Now George W. Bush faced a tougher opponent than Ann Richards. In order to get his programs passed, he would have to be able to work with the most formidable politician in Texas and the most powerful man in the state, Democratic Lieutenant Governor Bob Bullock. Their relationship would surprise even the most seasoned politicians in the Lone Star State. On January 17, 1995, 48-year-old George W. Bush was sworn in as the new governor of Texas. Bush realized that to accomplish his goals, he had to get the most powerful man in Texas on his side, Lieutenant Governor Bob Bullock. A politician for 42 years and Lieutenant Governor for 9, he was a legend in Texas politics, tough as nails, and a Democrat. To everyone's surprise, their potentially acrimonious relationship evolved into a true friendship.
None of us know quite what happened, but Bullock was just enamored with Bush. And we thought, how has this happened? You know, Bob Bullock is the sternest, gravelly-voiced old coot to come out of Texas in a long time, and he just thought Bush was sort of a younger brother to him.
Bush requested a meeting with the legendary politician even before the election. Bullock, a staunch Democrat, invited the young Republican candidate to his home. When they met, he found they shared a lot in common, both politically and personally.
He and I saw eye to eye on a great deal. I'm a recovering alcoholic. I was a terrible drinker at one time, and I told him that. I visited with him about it. He told me that he himself had quit drinking, and we talked about that for a bit. We talked about Texas and what we saw for the future, and frankly, his views about the state and his issues that he was running on were just parallel with mine.
Our relationship has grown over time. It wasn't always peaches and cream, because he's one tough guy. And I guess I can be too. And we butted heads on specific issues, but we never butted heads on was the desire to do right for Texas.
With Bullock's critical support, Bush succeeded in getting his major initiatives passed, including tougher juvenile justice laws, more autonomy for school districts, welfare reform, and tort reform, making it more difficult to win large financial settlements from corporations. But not everyone gives him high marks, and some criticize the bills he has passed.
I'm talking about governing skills. He's very successfully done tort reform so that our courts, you can barely get into them anymore, much less get a judgment out of them against a corporation. And I frankly don't think that doesn't count in my book as doing something good for people.
Something is either on his radar screen or it's not. And if it's not, it's really not.
But his admirers remained steadfast, and when the re-election campaign rolled around in 1998, Lieutenant Governor Bob Bullock, soon to retire, rocked the political establishment by enthusiastically endorsing Bush against a fellow Democrat, Gary Morrow, even though he was the godfather of Morrow's child.
The people of the country and people of this state want somebody that acts and performs a little bit better than they do. Just a tiny bit better. They're looking for somebody that's got a little bit of something that they don't have and that they can look up to. And they're not looking for another Jesus Christ to walk across the Colorado River this afternoon.
Bullock wouldn't be the only Democrat to cross over to the Bush camp. Texas is almost 1/3 Hispanic. George W. Bush was the first governor to reach out to this largely Democratic community.
A muchos demócratas que me apoyan porque siempre cumplo.
He knew Texas, he knew the border, he knew El Paso in a real, genuine way. He spoke Spanish. He's Republican, I guess, by tradition, by family, and by beliefs, but he doesn't let demagoguery stand in the way of practicality of getting things done.
The 1998 campaign turned out to be one of the easy ones. He entered it with a 76% approval rating. And when Election Day rolled around, no one was greatly surprised when he won with an impressive re-election victory, winning with 69% of the vote.
And I feel like in the near future you will be the president, and I hope that you're as good as your dad was.
Thank you.
Okay?
That's a tall order to fill.
That's
Thanks.
Right. He's a good man.
He is a good man.
Not only in Texas, but across the nation, Republicans, desperate to win back the White House, were now asking if George W. Bush might not be the ideal candidate to reunite a divisive and fragmented party. On January 19, 1999, he swept into office for his historic second term. Before long, the phones were ringing at the governor's mansion, calls from Republican leaders across the country hoping to persuade George Bush to run for the office of the President of the United States. In June 1999, Bush decided to enter the presidential race. As in his previous campaigns, one obvious asset was his ease with people.
Whatever it is, whatever he's doing, people love being around him, love working with him, and are magnetized to him.
His everyman style won over the Republican Party and won him the primary nomination.
People got comfortable with Bush. A lot of being president is people deciding who they want to look at for 4 years or 8 years. And slowly but surely, by fits and by starts, George Bush became a plausible president.
His opponent, Al Gore, seemed to have all the advantages. He was the incumbent vice president in a time of unprecedented prosperity, and many thought that the younger Bush had made it to the national stage on his father's name alone. He seemed ill-prepared for global leadership, and at times was even ridiculed, as when he would not or could not name the leader of Pakistan.
The new Pakistani general has just been elected. He's not elected. This guy took over office. He appears he's going to bring stability to the country, and I think that's good news for the subcontinent.
And you can name him.
General, I can't name the general.
And it's
General.
There's not much there. I mean, this is not a wonderful, impressive guy. He doesn't have great depth or intelligence. He's a perfectly affable fellow.
But he had other things going for him.
Texas is a very important state in any presidential contest. If you can win Texas twice, the thinking goes, you can probably win the country.
The theory seemed to work. Bush kept gaining on Al Gore, and the race for the White House ended as a true cliffhanger.
That Florida is, from our point of view, now too close to call. It was projected for Mr. Gore earlier in the evening. It is now too close to call.
In the end, the Supreme Court stepped in, and George W. Bush would once more follow in his father's footsteps, this time as president of a very divided United States.
And then immediately after the Florida mess, it was clearly a strategic choice of the Bush operation to act as though there had been no recount, to act as though there had been a mandate, even though it lost the popular vote, creating a kind of dramatic Shakespearean effect that he was, in fact, the winner.
Domestic issues seemed to be the new president's main priorities. Education, tax relief, Social Security, and faith-based initiatives were high on his agenda. Bush, who had barely set foot outside the United States before taking office, showed little interest in foreign affairs. Everything changed on September 11th, 2001.
I can hear you!
I think he found his voice and his mission on that pile of rubble down at Ground Zero the week after the attacks.
The world hears you, and the people who knock these buildings down will hear all of us soon.
He is a man comfortable with clarity. He's a man comfortable with defining things in Manichaean terms. That is, there is good and there is evil in the world. And suddenly the world broke exactly into that worldview for him.
Every nation in every region now has a decision to make. Either you are with us or you are with the terrorists.
Bush was transformed into a president with a singular goal: fighting the war on terror. The first to feel President Bush's determination was the mastermind behind the attacks, Osama bin Laden. On October 7th, 2001, Bush sent fighter planes to bomb bin Laden's camps in Afghanistan. In a matter of weeks, the Taliban rulers that had supported bin Laden were toppled. U.S. intelligence agencies began to identify al-Qaeda operatives around the world. The inexperienced president had proven himself as the commander-in-chief, but the war on terrorism was far from over. Bush soon set his sights on a new target, Saddam Hussein. Disarming the Iraqi ruler of weapons of mass destruction became the focus of his new mission to rid the world of terrorists.
States like these and their terrorist allies constitute an axis of evil, arming to threaten the peace of the world.
People who've talked to him about it say it is visceral. He hates the guy in his gut. He thinks that he is truly a danger to this country who must be stopped. And there was a feeling that he and Cheney share that during the 90s, American foreign policy had gone kind of flabby. And so that if we acted aggressively in the face of a threat, that we would make the country safer, partly because it would be a clear signal to enemies that the deterrent of our armed forces was real.
The president's leadership in the new war on terror boosted his popularity, and helped usher in a sweeping victory for the Republicans in the 2002 midterm congressional elections.
It was an enormous psychological victory. George Bush won seats, got back the Senate, and suddenly you had an opposition in disarray.
Bush seemed invincible in the fall of 2002 when he took his case for disarming Iraq to the United Nations.
Saddam Hussein's regime is a grave and gathering danger.
Passing Resolution 1441, the UN Security Council unanimously agreed to set a timetable for Hussein's full compliance with its demands to disarm. UN inspectors were sent back in, and Iraq began to show signs of cooperation. So when the first deadline arrived in January of 2003, the UN voted to extend the inspection timetable. But Bush quickly grew impatient with what he considered Saddam's delay tactics.
This business about, more time. How much time do we need to see clearly that he's not disarming? As I said, this looks like a rerun of a bad movie, and I'm not interested in watching it.
By February, Bush had sent 200,000 troops to the region and vowed to use military force, even without support of the UN. But his threats alienated many in the international community, like France and Russia, key members of the UN Security Council.
Diplomatically, it has been a long and torturous road. I don't think we've seen this depth of anti-Americanism, certainly in the years since World War II. This is suddenly a very complicated world that a man we didn't particularly elect for foreign policy is managing.
And overseas, Bush's willingness to do it alone was evidence to many of a cowboy mentality. Millions of people around the world took to the streets to protest. But President Bush was undeterred. In early March, Bush held a rare primetime press conference to make his case yet again to the American people.
These are the actions of a regime that systematically and deliberately is defying the world.
By mid-March, diplomatic efforts to gain support for military action in Iraq had been exhausted. The president made a special address to the country.
Saddam Hussein and his sons must leave Iraq within 48 hours. Their refusal to do so will result in military conflict.
Why does it have to happen now? Is it more dangerous to leave him in power, or for the United States to act alone and risk emboldening and creating new enemies and terrorists all around the world?
To George Bush, the answer was clear. Following a spectacular aerial attack dubbed Shock and Awe, ground troops moved into Iraq. This decisive action came to define the Bush presidency. Within a month, the U.S.-led coalition forces reached Baghdad. By May of 2003, Iraq was effectively under U.S. occupation.
Major combat operations in Iraq have ended. In the Battle of Iraq, the United States and our allies have prevailed.
But the conflict was far from over, and insurgent attacks in the years that followed have killed more than 1,500 American troops and injured more than 11,000. Meanwhile, Saddam Hussein's weapons of mass destruction, or WMD, often cited as the main reason for invading Iraq, were nowhere to be found. Coupled with shocking reports of abuse of Iraqi prisoners, the missing WMD caused further damage to America's image abroad. Even the capture of Saddam Hussein in December 2003 could not keep the fragile coalition behind the invasion from starting to fray. Within months, Spain became the first major ally to pull its forces out of Iraq, yet George Bush remained resolute.
Something is either on his radar screen or it's not, and if it's not, it's really not.
The cost of waging war took a toll on the U.S. economy, already troubled by record budget deficits and high oil prices. With less than a year before the next election, it appeared George W. Bush might follow his father's footsteps once again as a one-term president. To forestall that, Bush spent both time and money campaigning in key battleground states and spending record amounts on advertising.
I'm optimistic about America because I believe in the people of America. I'm President Bush, and I approve of this message.
As usual, the presidential race became a Bush family affair. Twin daughters Barbara and Jenna joined the campaign after graduating from college, and the press covered every move the first daughters made. By September, all the advertising and campaigning had paid off. The race tightened as Bush prepared to face Democratic challenger John Kerry in several debates. The first focused on national security and the war, presumed to be the president's strong point.
It's hard to argue that he has done anything other than stake his entire presidency on the idea that he's right about Iraq. I don't really think it's going to matter how the economy is doing or whether he has managed a prescription drug benefit for seniors if this goes really badly.
But Bush seemed oddly unfocused and struggled during the first debate.
I decided the right hand, and now we're fighting them now. And it's hard work. I understand how hard it is. I get the casualty reports every day. I see on the TV screens how hard it is.
Most pundits believed that his challenger, John Kerry, was the clear winner.
I don't believe the president took us to war as he should have. The winning of the war was brilliant.
Bush rebounded in the final debates, however, succeeding in portraying Kerry as a vacillating candidate and weak on defense.
Weapons of mass destruction.
In the end, Bush succeeded where his father had failed, winning a second term and garnering more votes than any other presidential candidate ever had. On January 20th, 2005, he was sworn in for a second time. During his second term, Bush continued to press for change in the Middle East. The long-standing conflict between Israelis and Palestinians was put on a new track towards resolution, and Iraq saw its first democratic elections.
America will stand with the allies of freedom to support democratic movements in the Middle East and beyond, with the ultimate goal of ending tyranny in our world.
At home, one big issue was Social Security. Administration officials said full Social Security benefits could not be guaranteed in the future.
The system, however, on its current path is headed toward bankruptcy, and so we must join together to strengthen and save Social Security.
Bush campaigned hard for an overhaul of the Social Security system and staged a 60-day, 60-city tour to promote it. His proposal would create personal investment accounts that he believes would benefit younger workers.
Here's why the personal accounts are a better deal. Your money will grow over time at a greater rate than anything the current system can deliver.
But Americans were not convinced. Polls showed that 64% of respondents disapproved of the Bush proposals and only 31% approved. Americans continue to be divided at home and, at least in some countries, reviled abroad. Through it all, George W. Bush remains as resolute and steadfast as ever.
There's still some idea of manifest destiny within him. That is what his father had been taught and what his grandfather had been taught, and that this family was here to serve and to lead. It's this sense of family invincibility, of family faith, that we are Bushes and we can win.